Welcome to today's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast, your channel for super easy, no-nonsense advice on how to declutter and organise your home. Please welcome your hosts, professional organisers Ingrid Jansen and Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 52 of the Declutter Hub podcast. We're Ingrid and Leslie and we're helping people declutter their homes. Check out members.declutterhub.com for more information on our step-by-step online courses, live Q&A sessions we do every 2 weeks, our membership community, and our checklists and guides. In today's episode, Leslie and I are talking about loft organizing. This is a 3-part series and this is part 2. Last episode, we talked about all the habits and emotions that determine why we store things in a loft. And today we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of decluttering. Leslie, have you got a loft? Confess.
You know what? I don't have a loft.
Oh. Well, that's very helpful, is it?
No, but I've decluttered many a loft in my time, let me tell you, and banged my head like also millions of times on the rafters and got splinters in my feet and been freezing and nearly fallen down it. So yeah, you know what? I've got a lot of experience of loft decluttering and organising, let me tell you.
And you've got a basement. So, I mean, you have a basement instead of a loft. So it's basically the same thing. It's basically stuff, a place where stuff goes that nobody wants anymore.
Yeah, for the moment. Yeah, not in my house. Not in my house. Everything is very useful that I have in my house, of course.
Okay. So what kind of stuff do we find in there? So let's just talk about just what the kind of stuff we find up there. So our listeners have an idea of what we're talking about.
I think they already know, to be fair. They're all like, yeah, tick, tick, tick. Yeah, there's things like old furniture that you're keeping for a rainy day. Obviously, all the decorations go up there, don't they? Christmas, Easter, Chinese New Year, Halloween, etc., etc. All the different decks go up there.
Yeah, lots of old suitcases, old and new.
Lots of sentimental stuff as well. So memory boxes. So if you can't have memory boxes in your house, the loft is the ideal place to store those. But sometimes we have quite the large amount of memory boxes, don't we? And sentimental things.
Actually, my camping and my skiing gear is in my loft, so that's really helpful. So I want to keep that. So we're not going to declutter my skiing gear, okay?
Oh no, and that's the perfect place for it. If you've not got a garage or somewhere in your house that you can keep it. And it's pretty tricky sometimes to get the camping and skiing gear up there, I'm not going to lie. But it is an ideal space for it as long as it's clean and dry.
Yep. I find tons of baby equipment, old cots, old prams, old baby baths, old mattresses, cribs, you name it. The shop full of stuff, I find baby equipment in the loft.
Because they come with a lot of stuff and we are desperate to get that stuff out of our house. So the first opportunity that we've got to get it in the loft, we do, don't we? Because we're like, plastic goes up. And so, yeah, there's loads of baby equipment in lofts as well. For good reasons sometimes and for other sometimes not for good reasons.
Yeah. I find lots of seasonal items like fans for the summer, heaters for the winter. Summer and winter clothes, the not only the heavy ski clothes, but also if people have small wardrobes, they keep their summer or their winter clothes up in the loft.
Stuff that they kind of rotate in. So if you've got like a rotation system going on, then those kind of things are allowed to go up in the loft. But we're going to talk a little bit more about rotation systems later. Yeah.
And of course, clothes as well from kids. If you have 1, 2, 3, 4 kids, people use the loft as some sort of almost recycling of let's put the next size into a box or in a bag, and then we'll find it when the next kid reaches that age, and then we'll go through it again. And so lots and lots of kids' clothes as well.
Exactly. And let's not forget books. It's quite often an overflow for books. It's quite often an overflow for paperwork, magazines that we don't want, course notes, work stuff, you name it, it will be in a loft somewhere across the world, won't it?
Yeah. And that's, I think, why it is actually really overwhelming. And it is really a big job. So let's talk a little bit about logistics before we go into the decluttering. Why is it so overwhelming, and why is it such a big job? What do we need to sort out and think out before we actually open that loft letter and start to pull things out?
Well, I think it's some of the, we talked about in the last episode, the first episode, part 1. So if you've not listened to that, please go back and listen to it, because that's all about the habits and emotions. We talked about it being, the decisions are not that difficult to make sometimes, but it's the logistics that cause problems. As well as being tricky to declutter, it's also tricky to put stuff away, which is why we get this kind of dumping ground scenario as well, really, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So that's the difficult. So logistics, it's worth talking about for a couple of minutes, just the kind of things that different people might have to think about. Some people have got a fantastic loft, it's carpeted, it's got windows, it's beautiful. It's more or less another room in their home. But for other people, it's a tricky space to work in.
Yeah, definitely. It is often quite dark. So hopefully you have a light up there. If not, I would really recommend getting a light source up there. Even maybe get your lamp from downstairs. If there's no light at all, you need to have some light to work in. Can you get up and down the loft ladder easily? Is it quite sturdy, or is it a bit wonky? And do you almost need to have somebody there to hold that loft ladder for you? Is the floor safe to work? Have you got a nice boarded loft, and do you feel happy walking around in your loft? Or is it almost kind of you have to balance on the beams going from one thing to the next? So you have to be really on high alert when you work in a loft if you're not sure about the floor space. Of course, it can actually really cold in winter and very hot in the summer. So I actually did a loft declutter recently, and we actually had to put some fans up there. And it wasn't even a roasting hot day, but it just gets really warm because it's the top of the house. So we found a fan and we plugged it in. So we actually got some electricity. We got a long electricity extension, and we put a fan in. And that was really, really nice.
Yeah, no, I can guarantee whenever I've worked with clients, it's either 90 degrees outside, and let me tell you, it gets roasting hot, doesn't it, in a loft when it's hot outside, or it's the depths of winter, and so it's freezing cold. I never do a loft in kind of April or May when it's normal weather. It's always in the extremes of temperature, and it's really relevant because it really affects your energy levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think check out if there actually is an electricity plug upstairs. So if you do want to hoover a little bit, or maybe there's lots of spider webs up there and you want to kind of do a bit of a clean out before you get started, check out if you've got an electricity point, or maybe get a long extension cord as well.
Yeah, you also need to think logistically about what's going to happen to the stuff that you take out, don't you? So think about that in advance, because the volumes of stuff that can come out of a loft if you're doing a good declutter are huge. And so have you got people that can go to the recycling centre for you? Have you got, a really large car that you're going to fit everything into? In fact, do you need a skip? We don't often recommend a skip, but sometimes if you are doing a big loft declutter, sometimes that's the best way. Do you need a man with a van? There's so many options, and you will know what the answer to those is for you individually, but think about it before you get started, because the last thing that you want to do is to declutter your loft and have all that stuff sitting in your hallway over the weekend, because that is mightily depressing.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing. It is like the box is never, it keeps coming out of that hatch, and you're like, how much stuff is on there? So you don't want to turn your whole house into a tip because you haven't thought before what is going to happen with this stuff. And actually there's a service here as well that you can actually, the men will go up the loft and get it out. And not, so you don't only get a skip or a man with a van, but they actually bring it down from the loft all the way down, because there's some stuff can be really heavy. So you need to really think about that. And, also be realistic if you need help. Do you need help from a friend or a family member or a neighbor or a child, or maybe a professional organizer if you can do that. But don't try and do this all by yourself unless you want to do one box at a time.
Do you know what? I'm just sat here with a smile on my face, remembering a loft that Katie and I did. And everything was great. And now it's a big loft. It was a nice space. but the lady kept all those old TVs, and you know how heavy those old TVs are. And me and Katie between us, because it was an elderly lady that we were doing it for, so we couldn't enlist her help, unfortunately. So between the two of us trying to balance these old TVs and stuff like that, it wasn't perhaps the most sensible thing in the world to do. But yeah, then we did those carpet, a huge carpet the size of a whole room. We're like, come on, we can do this. Just like, what are we doing? So yeah, I think that kind of service where the sturdy man might bring it down from the loft might have been a good idea, but then that's quite difficult because you want to go through and declutter the stuff. So often when I'm working in a loft, I do work within the loft, but the stuff needs to come out to create a space for you to work in.
Yeah, and that's exactly my next point. You probably, the aim will be to create some space in the loft itself, but you also want to have somewhere outside of the loft that you can have some space. So for example, if you find a box with lots of books or paperwork or photographs, you probably don't want to look at that in a loft where if it's quite dark in your loft, you're going to strain your eyes trying to figure it all out. So you probably then have to take it down, have a look through it. But also, if you do find a box with photographs, I would say put that to the side and do that later and start doing all the more bulkier items first. So you don't lose the momentum you don't get stuck into, oh, look at this photo. So you probably want to do the boxes with smaller things to the side, get the bulky stuff done first, and then go more smaller into the nitty gritty of it.
Yeah, definitely. Because if you can work up there, that's going to be the most sensible thing logistically. The last thing you need to do is take things down and up. But as you say, there are some things where it's sensible to do that, where you need good light or you need lots of time.
Yeah.
You don't want to sort through boxes and boxes of photographs sat on the floor in a dark, dingy loft, really, do you?
Exactly.
You want to do that. You want to be able to take time over that. But that's going to be specific things. That's not going to be everything.
Yeah. One really good example for that is I was actually helping a client sort through all her kids' clothes, and she had 4 kids. So kid clothes were being passed down from one kid to the next, but it all had gotten into black bin bags. So she actually was able to order some boxes. So we took all the clothes down, sorted them all size-wise. In the meantime, went through them and actually realized and said, is this actually going to be nice for the next one, or has it had its best time? And then we label all the boxes, and then we put all the boxes back up. But because of having to look at all the little labels in the clothes for the size, we couldn't have done in a dark loft. You're taking stuff up and down all the time. That's why I think what makes it so tiring as well.
Yeah, I know at the end of the day when I've done a loft declutter, let me tell you, it is exhausting.
Yeah.
And it's dirty, it's not great environmentally, things like that. There's loads of things that come into play. So have a think about that before you embark on your loft. Some lofts are better than others. Whether you've got a nice one or a difficult one. So I think we wanted to talk about logistics because that's important to think about. It's all about this planning, isn't it? Planning your day, planning your weekend, planning an appropriate amount of time rather than just thinking, well, that's what I'm going to do today. So it's really important to do these big things, garages, lofts, those kind of things. It's important to do some planning because they're going to you can't really break it down into bite-sized chunks. This is going to be a job that you're probably going to need to do all in one go or over a weekend. I think what we wanted to do was we wanted to talk about some sort of typical questions when we're decluttering that we find up there. So in no particular order, and the one thing that I wanted to say about these is there's no right or wrong answers. So what we are not expecting is for you to get rid of everything based on the questions that we're going to suggest to you that you ask, because only you know in your individual circumstances whether it's the right decision to keep them or let them go for yourself. But we just wanted to give you a little bit of food for thought and talk about some of the things where we have barriers in our minds that stop us from getting rid of things that sometimes we should be getting rid of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, we're going to go through some questions you can ask yourself when you're decluttering to make it easy for you to decision if you want to declutter them or not.
Yeah, there's something, it's always interesting because when I'm working with clients, there's something quite empowering about somebody being next to you. That because we do that every day. And sometimes people know themselves what the answer is, but they find it really difficult to come to that conclusion themselves without a prompt. So what we're hoping here is that you can do this on your own. And so there's no particular order, because there's no particular order for the most part when we're doing a declutter in a loft as to what things just come, and you have to work around it in a kind of clockwise method. So let's talk about some of the things that we find up there and the questions that we're going to ask.
A lot of the things we find is hand-me-downs from other people. And I think we need to ask ourselves, am I actually going to use this stuff? I mean, the people gave it to me with the best intentions, but now I think you need to be honest with yourself and go, am I actually going to use this?
And I think there are loads of things that come into play. And let's face it, hand-me-downs are not just things that you've been given. Hand-me-downs are from one child to another within your own family as well. So for me, for example, I've got 2 boys and a girl, boy, girl, boy. So 7 years between Luke and Nathan. So that 7 years in terms of fashion and what you would put a child in was very different. And so I wouldn't probably put something, I'm not saying there was nothing, but for the most part, I wouldn't have put Nathan in something that I had from Luke. And probably because I didn't have it because I'd already decluttered it, to be fair. But do you know what I mean? Fashion, I think the point I'm trying to make is that fashions change. And so, really, really think that through. And, it's hard, isn't it? We talked about in the last podcast, which is about the guilt that we feel, getting rid of things that have cost so much money, and kids' clothes, they're in them for such a short amount of time, aren't they? We feel really guilty just letting that go. Baby clothes in particular, a baby might only be in something 4, 5, 6 weeks and then it's gone, and that might be something that costs 20 or 30 pounds. And so you do feel guilty about it. Almost feels very wasteful, doesn't it? And so what you try and do then is you try and alleviate your own guilt by passing it on to somebody else for them to get use out of it. But let's work that through, and let's not let it become a burden to somebody else. So hand-me-downs is something that you need to have an appropriate system that we'll talk about in the Zoning and Organisation podcast, which is coming next week. You really do need to have a system for that. If you're going to get hand-me-downs, you need to make sure that the people that are giving you hand-me-downs, that you like the stuff that they're giving you, and you also need to have an honest conversation with them. What do I do with this stuff if I don't want it for whatever reason? Can I send it to charity? Do you want me to give it back to you so that you can pass it on to someone else, etc., etc.? So hand-me-downs is a big one. And, for people with families, there might be 10, 12, 14 bin bags of random stuff that's up there that just sits up there for years and years. So we definitely need a system in place, and we need to pare that right down.
Yeah. And also I'm just thinking as well, it's not only the hand-me-downs you get from other people, but I also find a lot of stuff in people's lofts that they're holding on to in case their brother or sister will one day have kids, maybe, possibly. And I'm like, oh, are they expecting? No. Then they're just dating. They're not even married yet. And I'm like, okay. So they're dating. They're not engaged. They're not married. They're not pregnant. You don't even know if they actually want to have children or not. But you're keeping all this stuff to pass down to other people. Maybe one day.
You need to join the 21st century, Ingrid. Not everyone needs to get engaged and married to have a baby.
I know. But you know what I mean.
They're not even married yet.
Well, my sister is not married and they're happy and they've got 3 kids. So I'm cool with that.
Oh, you're all cool.
I know.
Modern all of a sudden. Yeah. And the other thing is about, you're absolutely right. And that's where baby equipment and things like that, we see so mumuch baby equipment up there, don't we? Car seats, Moses baskets, even feeding stuff. Old nappies, not used nappies, but nappies, all those kind of things that are up there. One of the questions that I would ask is, if you have a new baby, are you going to put your new baby into a cot that's 10 or 15 years old? Are you going to get your new baby to use bottles that are 10 or 15 years old? The answer to these questions might be, yes, I would. Yeah, so we're not saying, well, you wouldn't do that. It's far from us to say whether you would or you wouldn't, but we're asking whether you would. And quite often, we keep things for our kids all the time. We keep things for grandkids, and they won't use them. If you give it a bottle from, 2005 to your child that's expecting now, they won't use them for different reasons.
Yeah.
Maybe in some cases. Not great for sustainability, but that's the truth for the most part, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think also then the good question to ask yourself is, will my kids actually want the stuff that I'm keeping for them? Because if your answer is probably no, then that's a good reason that you can declutter it and maybe ask them, there's a good point in asking them, I'm hanging on to a lot of stuff, but do you see yourself actually using all of this stuff? Or am I just hanging on to it because I can't let it go?
Yeah, because we work with people at different stages of life all the time, don't we? So what we work with, we work with the older generation who are keeping stuff for their kids because they think that it might come in, and it's going back to this idea from the kind of 70s and 80s last year where you need to help someone to set up home. But things are very different now, aren't they? Because people can go to places like IKEA or, cheaper places, and they can set themselves up for not that much money. And so things are not as expensive as they used to be. To buy a dinner service back in the 70s and 80s was a huge deal, whereas now you can probably go and get it for a tenner. And so it's a bit more throwaway and a bit cheaper than it used to be. So people's ideas are very different now in terms of what they want. So we work with the parents that are keeping the stuff for their children. And then we also work with the children in the kind of 30s who are like, my mum and gave me this and I really don't want it because I don't want a patterned dinner service. I want a white one, that kind of thing. And so we work at both ends of the spectrum, but it's all about that conversation. It's all about, do you want it? Do you want your mum to keep things for you? Do you not?
Let's talk about some other stuff then that we also find up there and what are good decluttering questions. So what I also regularly find is furniture. We mentioned it in our list of things we find, and it's not only furniture, but it's also pictures and frames and ornaments and all of those kinds of bits that have been taken out of a living room or out of a bedroom somewhere and then ended up in the loft. So I think a good question you ask yourself is, am I ever going to put these things back? Am I going to put these things back into my house, or am I just storing them in my loft just for storing's sake?
It's just that emotion, isn't it? That emotion that has taken you to a point where you say, I want a new dining room set. I want to replace the picture that's on my wall with a different one because I don't like it anymore. I want to get a new lamp. That one's not fit for purpose. That rug doesn't work for me anymore. I don't want that photograph of my child when they graduated because it seems a little bit old-fashioned. But then you feel so guilty because it's been such a big part of your life, and you feel that it's got worth to somebody else that you then keep it. But those are exactly the things that actually we need. Those are the hard decisions, aren't they? Because they have been a big part of our lives. So it's almost about recognizing something's usefulness to you and knowing that it served that purpose and now that purpose is gone and moving on to something else, or passing it on to somebody who will want to use it at a charity shop or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's really, certainly things like dining sets, like pictures, like ornaments, they've played a big part on your mantelpiece in your living room, and they have served their purpose, and it's might be time to let them go rather than to keep hold of them.
Yeah. And it's the same with books as well, isn't it? Especially if a loft can be quite damp. Hopefully it's dry, but it can be quite damp as well. But if we find boxes with textbooks, and we find old travel guides, and we find books that don't fit on the bookshelf, so I've ended up in a box in the loft. And besides the fact they're super heavy and, that's not very good for your floors. But if they're in a box in your loft, you're never going to read them again because they're kind of stuck up there.
I think that's it, isn't it? And some people, of course, and we talked at the beginning of these questions that there's no right or wrong answer. And some people are going through a transition, aren't they? So some people know that at the moment they're in, particularly people that are just starting out, people in their early 20s who are in a studio flat. They hopefully at some point they will get a bigger house and they will have space to put books that they really want to keep and things like that. But if you're kind of further on in your life, and the reason why you've got books up in your loft is because they can't fit on the bookshelves that you've got that are already plentiful in your house, then you really have to question that. Because I would absolutely say, don't store any books in your loft unless there's a very specific purpose for that, like I am moving to a bigger house next year. Because otherwise, why are they there? You're never going to go up to them in the loft, and depending on the loft space, obviously, because it may be very accessible. And so just really think that through. But it's about this kind of, it's sentimental stuff, it's guilt, all those emotions all wrapped up that mean that we keep books and we don't want to let go of them. And it becomes very overwhelming and it takes over the space. So books for me is a no-no in a loft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's kind of same category. I also see CDs or record collections or things like that. if you have a record player and you have the records, have the records with the record player and put them somewhere that you can actually play them. But if you know that you now also always listen to your iPod, or you've got an Alexa that you do music on, you've got a streaming service or Spotify or whatever it is, why do you still have the records and the record player, or maybe even the CDs, if they're just in a loft gathering dust and being boxed up and never used again?
Do you know what's an interesting one actually about the records? It is one where the kind of evolution of fashions and trends has changed things. So there are a lot of people, I have to say, who work with, who did get rid of their record collections and now regret that. So there's very few people, I think, in life who have regret when we're decluttering people that have regrets about things. But if there's one thing that I can highlight, it's people that got rid of their record collections. But I do believe now that records have come back in again, and that's for the past 10 years or so, isn't it? That if you are going to keep those record collections, they can now come into your general use in your home and not be in a loft or a basement. So, think carefully about those kind of collection type things. I think videos is a completely different thing. We're never going to go back to videos. I can safely say, we're probably never going to go back to DVDs or CDs, I wouldn't have thought. But records is a different way of listening to music, isn't it? So it's an interesting one, the records, because that is something that people do regret.
Well, I had a record collection, and we had a really good record player, and we actually had it all in general use for about a decade and a half. Never played it, and then decluttered it after we kind of like, okay, let's do it. And now I know there's revival, and I could now say, oh, I miss my record collection. Even when it was in general use, we never played them. Maybe once every 2 or 3 years we put a record on. I mean, for me, I was like, okay, there's just no point.
I think it's, for me, what's happened in our house is that those records have now gone to Nathan. Yeah?
Yes.
So the cooler ones of our record collection from the 80s and 90s have gone to Nathan, so he's listening to them. So I think it's that, isn't it? We're probably never going to go back to records ourselves, but he has done. And so yeah, it's just one to think about, really, the records. Yeah. It's an interesting one. It's probably one of the only things that people have regrets about.
Yeah. Loads and loads of suitcases as well, the old-fashioned ones, the big bulky ones, the ones without wheels, actually. So I find them lots of times in lofts. Those are, I think, an easy one to declutter for most people. But be realistic about it. For me, people, you could say, oh, well, I can use them to store stuff in. I don't know. I mean, it's not visible then, is it, at all, when it's in a suitcase that hasn't got any wheels, and you overfill them because they're far too big and they get far too heavy. For me, that would be an easy one to declutter.
Definitely. I don't like the idea of storing clothes and stuff in suitcases because of this kind of barrier idea that you can't see in. If we're going to store things, they need to be labelled up appropriately, and suitcases don't really lend themselves very well to labelling. I think we all know that suitcases from 20 years ago probably can't be used as easily now, particularly if you're going on a plane, because of the weight restrictions and things like that. So really look at those. And again, the interesting thing is charity shops will take them, because there are people that are not going on planes and still need suitcases. So you can offload your suitcases to charity shops.
Also, appliance boxes I find all the time, from the large television that is still in the living room, because in case we ever move house one day, we can put our TV back in the box. Well, I've moved several times, also internationally, and they just wrap them up in blankets, and they make sure they really don't want your old appliance box to move your TV.
Exactly. No, they don't, because they don't go back in half the time anyway, because you've added some frame or stand or something on the bottom of them. So please let the appliance boxes go, because they are cluttering up lofts and garages and houses all over the country.
Yeah.
I mean, my son's recently moved out, and I just see it on the top of his wardrobe. They're not crazy, but they're iPad boxes, and I am chomping at the bit to get approval to get rid of them. It's their stuff. I've got 2 people in the house who love to keep hold of stuff, and that's Steve and Luke. And so, far be it from me to dictate to them what they do and don't get rid of. But I am, now Luke's moved out, so the rules have changed. You can either take your appliance boxes with you, or they're going in the bin. So That's this weekend's job.
You've like waited until he left. You saw the key leave the lock, and you're like, yes, the room is mine. It's back. It's mine. And I can declutter it now. Everything that's left is up for decluttering.
Yeah, no, not only the appliance boxes at this moment in time. I'm not going to get rid of the rest of his stuff. Not yet, anyway.
Oh, but that's good to know. So you're not going to put it in your loft then secretly, Leslie? Boxes full of
I haven't got a loft. We've established that. I can't even put appliance boxes in my loft. The other thing that we see up there all the time is like notes from courses that we have done, old, lever arch files full of stuff from work and things like that. Do yourself a favour and go through it and work out whether you actually need it. If it's sitting in a file up in your loft, chances are that you're not going to need it. If it's, take it to where it needs to be shredded. If it's something from work, just go through that process gradually, take all those things down and let it go. Course notes and work notes are things from a sort of bygone era sometimes, aren't they? That we keep and we just devour, particularly work-wise now. We use our information very differently. So notes they're not a thing of the past, but they kind of are from a work perspective for most people, aren't they, apart from courses?
Yeah, I mean, if you have university notes and you left university 20 years ago and they've ended up in a box in your loft, I mean, will you ever look at them again? 99.9% of people would say, no, I will never look at them again. But again,
it's hard because it's closing that chapter of your life, and that's why people don't want to do it. So maybe be specific, look at something, look at one essay or something that you're really super proud of, and keep that, but don't keep 10 lever arch files from my degree German with Dutch in 1987, which I haven't got, by the way.
Me neither. As soon as I started moving houses and everything, I was like, I am decluttering all this paperwork. I do not want it anymore. I have kept a couple of books that I thought were interesting, that have to do with hotel management and everything like that. But everything else, no. Gone, goodbye. I think I only kept my essay or my thesis for the end, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of thing. That's one thing, isn't it? The other thing that finds its way up there, paperwork-wise, is archival tax stuff. So if people own their own businesses or they know that they've got to keep tax stuff for a certain number of years, and quite often it goes up there in box files or in some kind of box, and it stays up there then years and years and years beyond the time that you need to keep it. And so don't let that happen. Go up there, keep a check on that, and make sure that you are offloading the years that you no longer need to make space for the ones that you do need.
Also, we find lots and lots of decorations of holidays, different holidays. We talked about Easter and Halloween and Chinese New Year, and I mean, a whole rafter of different decorations. But ask yourself, am I still actually decorating my house? I'm actually thinking about decluttering my Easter decorations, because a lot of times I'm away over Easter. So maybe it's time to declutter some of those decorations and give some stuff away from that. If maybe you're doing a bit of a smaller Christmas now than you used to do in the past, do you still put everything up? Maybe you want to put all the Christmas decorations together, but then have a declutter when you're actually setting up for Christmas and kind of think, okay, I haven't put this up in how many years? Let's declutter it, because it kind of grows. Every time you think, oh, I'll buy that, about that, or some people give you things for your decorations, and it can get really out of hand.
I mean, if I'm doing a loft declutter with a client, I will take the opportunity to go through the seasonal decorations, whatever they are at the time. But that's because that's our job to do that and to make sure we leave no stone unturned, really. So it would be a job that was unfinished if we had not gone through the decorations. But my advice to you would be, do your decorations as you're putting them up or as you're putting them away. So once you've put the stuff up for your holiday or whatever, look at what's left in the box and make really hard decisions on what's left. You've chosen not to put them up this time. Your house is probably not going to get any bigger, and there's not going to be any space to put any more decorations up. So that's probably the best time to look at decorations and make those decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Also, we find boxes and boxes full of photos and photo albums from family members. ask yourself the question, is actually my loft the best place to store all these photos? And do I need to declutter them from my loft? And maybe if I want to keep them, put them in another part of my house. Because if it is maybe a bit damp or maybe a bit cold or maybe so far tucked away in your loft that you never can actually reach the photos, then maybe it's not the right place for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, we're going on to photo organising here. It's a completely separate project for a rainy day. And we've got a podcast, I think, about photo organising as well, if you wanted to listen and start with the lovely Jo Jacob. So if you are interested in organising your photos, look at that. Obviously, you can, if you've got things in there, you can digitize things and so on. But a loft is definitely not the best place to store photographs unless it's a very specific, dry, clean loft.
Old toys are also in lofts.
It's the same principle again, isn't it, as the clothes and hand-me-downs and things like that in terms of whether we're going to keep them. There are some toys in life that are fairly timeless. I know one of my friends, and this is not uncommon, the only thing that she would really keep is Lego. People do tend to keep Lego to pass through generations because it doesn't really change that much. So we see quite a lot of Lego up there. You've got the kind of rotation of toys idea. So a lot of people don't have the space in their homes for all of the toys that they've got. So they like a rotation idea. But if you do like to rotate the toys every 3 months or 6 months, make sure that rotation system is working for you. Otherwise, it's just a load of toys up in the loft, and it's not, that are not getting rotated. So it's important. But the people who do toy rotation are generally going to be people that are super, super organized and efficient.
Yeah. And I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's the same for rotation of clothes as well. If you don't have enough wardrobe space and you have to keep some either summer or winter clothes in your loft, does your system work? Do you actually go up in your loft and get the clothes down? And do you look through it? And do you declutter it? Or have you actually not really done that for years and years, and it's just now a mountain of clothes up there and that nobody ever looks at anymore?
So it's an interesting one. So we could go on for hours and hours about all the different things, because there are so many different things up there in a loft, aren't there, that we could talk about. But I think we've given people a little bit of food for thought on that, haven't we? Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Ingrid?
No, I think for me, the last thing I want to say to our listeners is that if it's damp or damaged, bite that bullet. Even if it's a difficult one, if you find boxes with old towels and old curtains and the fabric has gotten a bit hard and crusty and just make sure you declutter that from your loft. There's no point in keeping all of that stuff. And I hope we've given you a whole long list of questions you can ask yourself to help you make those decisions when you're decluttering the items from your loft. So Leslie, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I think we're all done. As I say, I think we could go on for hours and hours talking about decluttering questions because there's such a mishmash of stuff in a loft.
Yeah.
But I think we've given people a little bit of food for thought, and I think that's the important thing.
Right. Well, listeners, we hope we have given you food for thought and that you've enjoyed our part number 2 about loft decluttering and organizing, and that you're already looking forward to part number 3, which we will have for you next week. And it's all going to be about organizing your loft and zoning your loft. What are you going to do this weekend? Are you going to go up in your loft, have a little look around and decide what items you are going to declutter, and if you're actually going to need some help from somebody else to get this project on the go? So thanks so much for taking the time to listen today. If you'd like to get more tips and advice, please follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as @DeclutterHub, and we have a lively, supportive Facebook group where we chat all things clutter. You can search for the Declutter Hub community and we'd love to see you there. Don't forget our brand spanking new membership. We are now offering step-by-step online courses, live Q&A sessions, and the membership community. Have a look on members.declutterhub.com for more information. If you don't want to miss the next weekly episode of the podcast, subscribe to the Declutter Hub podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. It will pop into your notifications each Friday. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast. Check out declutterhub.com for more inspiration and don't forget to tune in next week.